In the grand halls of Valdoria's royal palace, where centuries of tradition dictate every breath and whisper, a single decision by Queen Cordelia would shatter the delicate balance of power forever. What began as a quiet morning tea would end with Prince Alexander questioning everything he thought he knew about loyalty, family, and the woman he married. Behind the gilded doors and velvet curtains, a battle for the soul of the monarchy was about to begin, one that would expose secrets buried for decades and force a kingdom to choose between tradition and truth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria's eastern wing as Princess Isabella made her way to the Queen's private chambers. The click of her heels echoed through the corridors, a sound that had become as familiar to the palace staff as the morning bells of the cathedral. She carried herself with a grace that had made her beloved by the people of Valdoria, her auburn hair catching the light from the tall windows that lined the hallway. Isabella had been summoned for what Queen Cordelia called their monthly discussion, a tradition that had begun shortly after Isabella married Prince Alexander 5 years ago. These meetings had always been cordial, if somewhat formal, covering matters of charity work, public appearances, and the general duties expected of a future queen. But today, something felt different. The Queen's chambers were a study in understated elegance, decorated in deep burgundy and gold, with portraits of Valdoria's past rulers watching from the walls. Queen Cordelia sat behind her mahogany desk, her silver hair perfectly arranged, her blue eyes sharp and calculating. At 62, she remained a formidable presence, having ruled Valdoria with an iron will since her husband King Edmund's death 10 years prior. "Isabella, my dear," Queen Cordelia said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Isabella settled into the chair, noting the absence of the usual tea service. The Queen's hands were folded on the desk, and her expression was more serious than Isabella had ever seen it. A chill ran down Isabella's spine as she realized this would not be their usual pleasant chat about upcoming royal engagements. "I've been doing considerable thinking about the future of our monarchy," Queen Cordelia began, her voice measured and controlled. "About the direction Valdoria should take in these changing times. You've been part of our family for 5 years now, and I believe it's time for some adjustments." Isabella felt her heart begin to race, though she maintained her composed exterior. "What kind of adjustments, Your Majesty?" Queen Cordelia stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the palace gardens where gardeners were tending to the late autumn flowers. "The people of Valdoria need strong leadership, Isabella. They need someone who understands tradition, who respects the old ways, who can guide this kingdom with wisdom earned through experience." "I completely agree," Isabella replied carefully. "Alexander and I are committed to serving Valdoria with everything we have." The Queen turned back to face her, and Isabella saw something cold in those blue eyes. "That's precisely what concerns me, my dear. Your enthusiasm for change has not gone unnoticed. The modern ideas you've been introducing, the way you've been encouraging Alexander to question certain protocols. This is not the way of Valdorian royalty." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. She had indeed been working to modernize some of the more outdated royal traditions, but always with respect for the monarchy's core values. Her charity work focused on education and women's rights, causes she felt passionate about, and that had brought positive attention to the royal family. "Your Majesty, I've always tried to honor Valdorian traditions while also addressing the needs of our changing society. The education programs we've implemented have been incredibly successful, and the response from the people has been overwhelmingly positive." Queen Cordelia's lips curved into what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, the people do seem to adore you. Perhaps too much. You see, Isabella, popularity can be dangerous when it overshadows the established order. When a princess becomes more beloved than the reigning monarch, it creates complications." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She had never sought to overshadow Queen Cordelia, had always been careful to defer to her mother-in-law's authority in public. But It was true that her charitable work had gained significant media attention, and the public had responded enthusiastically to her more approachable style of royalty. I never intended to. Intentions matter little when the result threatens the stability of our institution, Queen Cordelia interrupted. Which brings me to why I've asked you here today. I made a decision that I believe is in the best interest of Valdoria and our family. Isabella gripped the arms of her chair, preparing herself for whatever was coming. I'm removing you from all official royal duties, effective immediately. You will no longer represent the crown at public events. Your charitable organizations will be transferred to other family members, and your role will be limited to supporting Alexander in private, family matters only. The room seemed to spin around Isabella. She struggled to process what she was hearing. You're essentially exiling me from royal life. I'm protecting the monarchy, Queen Cordelia said firmly. Your modern ideas and popularity have begun to undermine traditional royal authority. The people need to remember that change comes through the proper channels, not through individual initiative that bypasses established protocol. Isabella stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. This is about more than protocol, isn't it? This is about control. You're threatened by the fact that people respond positively to a more accessible royal family. Queen Cordelia's eyes flashed with anger. You forget yourself, young woman. I have guided this monarchy through some of its most challenging periods. I will not allow an outsider to destroy what generations of Valdorian royalty have built. An outsider? Isabella repeated, her voice rising. I've dedicated 5 years of my life to this kingdom. I've given everything to serve Valdoria and its people. And now you will serve by stepping back, Queen Cordelia replied coldly. The decision has been made. Alexander will be informed after his return from the northern provinces tomorrow. Until then, you will say nothing about this conversation to anyone. Isabella stared at the queen, seeing clearly for the first time the ruthless politician behind the grandmother facade. This wasn't about protecting tradition or stability. This was about eliminating a perceived threat to Queen Cordelia's absolute authority. What if Alexander disagrees with your decision? Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Queen Cordelia returned to her chair, her expression suggesting the matter was already settled. Alexander is my son and the future king. He understands the importance of maintaining royal unity. He will support the decision because he must. As Isabella left the queen's chambers, her mind raced with the implications of what had just occurred. She thought of all the children who would be affected by the sudden halt to her education programs, the women's shelters that would lose their royal patron, the countless people who had written to thank her for bringing a more human face to the monarchy. But more than that, she thought of Alexander, the man she loved, who had supported her every initiative, who had been so proud of the positive changes they were making together. How would he react to his mother's ultimatum? Would he fight for their partnership, or would his loyalty to the crown override his loyalty to his wife? As she walked through the palace corridors, Isabella passed servants who smiled and nodded respectfully, unaware that they might be witnessing one of her final days as an active member of the royal family. The weight of Queen Cordelia's decision pressed down on her like a physical burden, but beneath the shock and hurt, she felt something else beginning to grow: determination. She had not married Alexander simply to become a decorative royal wife. She had fallen in love with a man who shared her vision of a monarchy that served its people actively and compassionately. If Queen Cordelia thought she would simply accept this exile without a fight, she had greatly underestimated the woman her son had chosen to marry. That evening, Isabella sat in the private sitting room she shared with Alexander, staring at the phone that would connect her to her husband in the northern provinces. Queen Cordelia had forbidden her to speak of their conversation, but Isabella found herself questioning whether she owed any loyalty to a woman who had just attempted to destroy 5 years of dedicated service to Valdoria. The fire crackled in the fireplace as Isabella wrestled with her decision. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of the capital city, where thousands of Valdorians went about their evening routines, unaware that their beloved princess was facing the greatest crisis of her royal life. Tomorrow would bring Alexander's return, and, with it, the most important conversation of their marriage. Isabella had no way of knowing that across the palace, Queen Cordelia was making her own preparations, ensuring that when she presented her decision to Alexander, it would seem not just reasonable, but necessary for the survival of the monarchy itself. The battle for the future of Valdoria's royal family was about to begin, and only one vision would survive. Second Chronicle Prince Alexander's convoy approached the palace gates as the morning mist was lifting from the Valdorian countryside. He had spent 3 days in the northern provinces, meeting with local officials and visiting communities affected by the recent flooding. The trip had been successful, but he was eager to return to Isabella and share the stories of the resilient people he had met. As his car pulled into the palace courtyard, Alexander noticed an unusual stillness in the air. The staff members who greeted him seemed more formal than usual, their smiles strained. Something was different, but he couldn't quite identify what. His private secretary, Lord Harrington, approached with an urgent expression. "Your Highness, Her Majesty requests your immediate presence in the throne room. She specifically asked that you not return to your quarters first." Alexander frowned. The throne room was reserved for official state business, not casual family conversations. "Did she say what this concerns?" "No, sir. Only that it was a matter of great importance that could not wait." As Alexander made his way through the familiar corridors, he passed several courtiers who quickly averted their eyes. The palace felt different somehow, charged with an undercurrent of tension that made him increasingly uneasy. He hadn't been able to reach Isabella by phone the previous evening, which had struck him as odd since she usually called him during his travels. The massive doors of the throne room stood open, revealing Queen Cordelia seated not on the ornate throne itself, but in a high-backed chair positioned in front of it. Several senior advisors stood nearby, their faces grave. Alexander had seen this setup before. It was how his mother conducted the most serious royal business. "Alexander," Queen Cordelia said as he entered, "thank you for coming directly here. Please sit." Alexander remained standing, his military training making him wary of formal setups when he expected casual conversation. "Mother, what's this about? Why wasn't Isabella invited to this meeting?" "Isabella is precisely why you're here," Queen Cordelia replied, gesturing again to the chair. "Please sit. What I have to tell you will be difficult to hear." Alexander finally took the offered seat, his concern growing by the moment. "Has something happened to her? Is she hurt?" "Not physically, no. But I'm afraid she has become a significant problem for our family and for Valdoria itself." The words hit Alexander like a slap. "What are you talking about?" "Isabella has been nothing but dedicated to this kingdom. Her charitable work has brought more positive attention to the royal family than we've had in years." Queen Cordelia's expression remained impassive. "That's exactly the issue, my son. Her popularity has grown to dangerous levels. She has begun to overshadow the established royal hierarchy, and, more concerning, she has been using her position to promote ideas that undermine our traditional authority." Alexander stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Isabella's work has been brilliant. The education programs alone have improved literacy rates in rural areas by 15%. The Women's Initiative has provided job training for thousands. How can you possibly see this as problematic?" "Because it sets a precedent that individual royals can implement policy changes without proper consultation or approval," Queen Cordelia replied sharply. "Because her methods encourage people to view the monarchy as a vehicle for personal agendas rather than as the stable, consistent institution it must be." Alexander began pacing, his anger building. "Personal agendas? She's working to improve people's lives. Isn't that exactly what the monarchy should be doing? Within proper channels and with appropriate oversight," Queen Cordelia said. "Alexander, I've been queen for over a decade. I understand the delicate balance required to maintain royal authority while serving the people. Isabella's approach may seem admirable, but it's dangerously naive. So what are you proposing?" Queen Cordelia took a deep breath. "Yesterday, I informed Isabella that she would be stepping back from all official royal duties. Her charitable organizations will be transferred to other family members, and her public role will be significantly reduced. The color drained from Alexander's face. You did what? I made the decision necessary to protect this monarchy. Isabella will continue to be your wife and a member of our family, but her public influence must be curtailed before it causes irreparable damage to royal authority. Alexander stared at his mother in disbelief. You had no right to make that decision without consulting me. Isabella is my wife and my partner. We work together, and that partnership has become problematic, Queen Cordelia replied coolly. You've allowed your personal feelings for your wife to cloud your judgment about what's best for Valdoria. As future king, you must learn to separate emotional attachments from royal duty. The words cut deep, but they also ignited something fierce in Alexander. My personal feelings? I fell in love with Isabella partly because of her compassion and her desire to serve others. Those qualities make her an asset to this monarchy, not a liability. Those qualities make her popular with the people, yes. But popularity without proper control becomes dangerous. Look at history, Alexander. When individual royals become more beloved than the institution itself, it leads to instability and, ultimately, revolution. Alexander turned to face the advisors who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Do you all agree with this assessment? Lord Chancellor Morrison stepped forward reluctantly. Your Highness, there have been some concerns raised about the pace of change that Princess Isabella has been implementing. Some feel that a more measured approach might be advisable. Concerns raised by whom? Alexander demanded. The advisors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Alexander realized that his mother had been building a case against Isabella behind the scenes, gathering support from courtiers who value tradition above progress. Where is Isabella now? Alexander asked, his voice dangerously quiet. In your private quarters, I believe, Queen Cordelia replied. Alexander, I understand this is difficult, but you must trust my experience in these matters. Alexander started toward the door, then turned back. Mother, with all due respect, your experience comes from a different era. The Valdoria that Isabella and I envision is one where the monarchy serves actively and compassionately, not one where it maintains power through rigid hierarchy and fear of change. And if that vision destroys the monarchy entirely, what then, Alexander? Will your love for Isabella comfort you when Valdoria becomes a republic and our family loses everything our ancestors built? The question hung in the air as Alexander left the throne room, his mind reeling from the confrontation. As he walked toward his private quarters, he reflected on his mother's words. Was there truth to her concerns, or was she simply threatened by Isabella's success? He thought about the people he had met in the northern provinces, farmers and shopkeepers who spoke warmly about Princess Isabella's education programs, mothers who credited the women's initiative with helping them support their families. These people didn't seem to view Isabella as a threat to royal stability. They saw her as proof that the monarchy cared about their daily struggles. When Alexander reached his quarters, he found Isabella sitting by the window, still in her formal dress from the previous day. She looked as though she hadn't slept, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. Isabella, he said softly, approaching her carefully. She looked up at him with an expression of such pain that it nearly broke his heart. She told you, didn't she? Alexander knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. She told me her version. Now I want to hear yours. Isabella's voice was barely above a whisper as she recounted the previous day's conversation with Queen Cordelia. Alexander felt his anger rekindling as he heard how his mother had spoken to his wife, the dismissive way she had dismantled 5 years of dedicated work with a single decree. I don't understand how she can see helping people as threatening, Isabella said, tears streaming down her face. Everything I've done has been for Valdoria and its people. I've never tried to overshadow anyone or undermine royal authority. Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. I know, and I'm not going to let this stand. Isabella pulled back to look at him. What can you do? She's the queen. She has the support of the royal council. She may be the queen, but I'm the heir to the throne, and you're my chosen partner. We swore to serve Valdoria together, and I meant every word of that oath. For the first time since the confrontation with Queen Cordelia, Isabella felt a glimmer of hope. But she also saw the weight of the decision Alexander was facing. Supporting her meant directly challenging his mother's authority, potentially creating a rift in the royal family that could have far-reaching consequences. Alexander, I don't want you to have to choose between your family and me. Alexander cupped her face in his hands, his eyes fierce with determination. Isabella, you're my family. My mother has forgotten that the monarchy exists to serve the people, not to preserve its own power. If she can't see the value in what you've accomplished, then perhaps it's time for new leadership. The words hung between them, revolutionary in their implications. Alexander was essentially suggesting that Queen Cordelia's reign was becoming a liability to the kingdom, a position that bordered on treason by traditional royal standards. As the day progressed, news of the conflict began to spread quietly through the palace. Staff members whispered in corners, courtiers chose sides, and the media began to sense that something significant was happening behind the palace walls. By evening, several news outlets were reporting on unusual activity at the royal residence, though none yet understood the true scope of the crisis. In her private chambers, Queen Cordelia prepared for what she knew would be an even more difficult conversation with her son. She had expected Alexander to be upset, but she had underestimated the depth of his commitment to Isabella and their shared vision for the monarchy. If he continued to resist her authority, she would be forced to take even more drastic measures. The battle for the soul of Valdoria's monarchy had begun in earnest, with mother and son on opposing sides, and the future of the kingdom hanging in the balance. Third Chronicle word of the royal family's internal conflict had begun to leak beyond the palace walls by the third day, despite the royal household's best efforts to contain it. News reporters gathered outside the palace gates, speculating about the unusual number of high-level meetings and the absence of Princess Isabella from her scheduled public appearances. Alexander had spent the previous evening in his study, making phone calls to allies throughout the kingdom. He reached out to provincial governors, military commanders, and influential business leaders who had worked closely with Isabella on various initiatives. The response was overwhelmingly supportive of the princess, with many expressing shock at Queen Cordelia's decision. "Your Highness," Lord Harrington said as he entered Alexander's study that morning, "I have updates from several sources that I believe you should hear." Alexander looked up from the stack of letters he had been reading, messages of support for Isabella that had been pouring in from citizens across Valdoria. "What have you learned?" "The Queen has scheduled a meeting with the Royal Council for this afternoon. Sources suggest she intends to formalize her decision regarding Princess Isabella and seek official endorsement for the new restrictions on her role." Alexander's jaw tightened. "She's trying to make it legally binding before I can mount any effective opposition." "It appears so, sir. However, there's more. Several council members have privately expressed reservations about the Queen's approach. Lord Chancellor Morrison in particular seems uncomfortable with the speed and secrecy of these changes." Alexander stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where he could see protesters beginning to gather. Word had somehow gotten out about Isabella's situation, and supporters were organizing demonstrations calling for her reinstatement to full royal duties. "What about international reaction?" Alexander asked. The royal houses of neighboring kingdoms have been making discreet inquiries. Princess Isabella's work has gained international recognition, and several foreign dignitaries have expressed concern about the changes to her role. Alexander realized that his mother had underestimated the scope of Isabella's influence and the potential consequences of silencing her. This was no longer just a family dispute. It was becoming a matter of international diplomatic concern. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Isabella entered, carrying a folder of documents and looking more determined than she had since the crisis began. "Alexander, I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I believe there's something your mother doesn't fully understand about the situation she's created." Alexander turned to face his wife, noting the change in her demeanor. The tears and shock had been replaced by a steely resolve that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. "What do you mean?" Isabella opened her folder and spread several documents across Alexander's desk. "These are the legal documents governing my charitable organizations. Your mother assumes she can simply transfer them to other family members, but the reality is more complicated." She pointed to specific clauses in the paperwork. "When we established these programs, we structured them as independent foundations with their own boards of directors. I'm a founding patron, but the organizations have their own legal standing. The Queen cannot simply reassign them without board approval and legal procedures that could take months." Alexander studied the documents, beginning to understand Isabella's strategy. Which means that if she follows through on her threat to transfer my organizations, it will create a public legal battle that will expose exactly what she's trying to do. The boards of these foundations are filled with prominent Valdorian citizens who believe strongly in our work. They're not going to quietly accept having their patron removed for political reasons. Alexander felt a spark of admiration for his wife's foresight. "You planned for this possibility." "Not this specifically, but I've always been careful to establish our charitable work in ways that couldn't be easily dismantled by palace politics. These programs belong to the people they serve, not to the royal family." Alexander realized that his mother had walked into a trap of her own making. By attempting to dismantle Isabella's work, she was about to create exactly the kind of public controversy she claimed to be trying to avoid. "There's something else," Isabella continued. "I've been in contact with several of the program beneficiaries. They're not remaining silent about this situation. The literacy teachers we trained are organizing to demand answers about the future of their schools. The women in our job training programs are planning to march to the palace to ask why their opportunities are being taken away." Alexander stared at his wife in amazement. "You've organized a resistance movement." "I've simply informed people who benefit from our programs about the threat to their future. They're organizing themselves." The sound of raised voices from the courtyard drew their attention back to the window. The crowd of protesters had grown significantly, and Alexander could see signs reading "Save Our Princess" and "Isabella stands with us." Lord Harrington returned with an urgent expression. "Your Highness, the situation outside is escalating. The crowd is now several hundred strong, and more people are arriving every hour. The Queen has requested that palace security disperse the protesters." Alexander and Isabella exchanged glances. "Tell security to take no action against peaceful protesters," Alexander ordered. "They have every right to express their opinions." "Sir," the Queen specifically requested. "The Queen can make her own request to security," Alexander interrupted. "But, as future king, I will not authorize the suppression of peaceful citizens exercising their rights." Lord Harrington nodded nervously and left to relay the message. Alexander and Isabella both understood that this decision would be seen as a direct challenge to Queen Cordelia's authority, exactly the kind of public defiance that would force the issue into the open. 20 minutes later, Queen Cordelia herself appeared at Alexander's study door, flanked by 2 palace guards. Her face was flushed with anger, and her usual composed demeanor had cracked. "Alexander, you will order those protesters dispersed immediately, and you will stop undermining my authority in front of the staff." Alexander stood to face his mother, and Isabella moved to stand beside him. "Mother, I will not suppress peaceful citizens who are expressing legitimate concerns about the future of programs that benefit their communities. Those programs are being reorganized, not eliminated," Queen Cordelia replied sharply. "The protesters are being misled by inflammatory rumors." Isabella stepped forward. "Your Majesty, with respect, the protesters include teachers, students, and women whose lives have been directly improved by our work. They're not responding to rumors. They're responding to the reality that their programs are being threatened without explanation or consultation." Queen Cordelia's eyes flashed with fury as she turned to Isabella. "I told you to remain silent about our conversation. You told me not to discuss your decision," Isabella replied calmly. "I've honored that. I have not told anyone what you said to me, but I cannot control the fact that people are asking questions when their programs suddenly face uncertainty. Alexander watched this exchange with growing anger at how his mother was speaking to his wife. Mother, Isabella has every right to communicate with people who are affected by changes to her work. You cannot expect her to simply disappear without offering any explanation to those who depend on her programs. Queen Cordelia turned back to Alexander. I can and I do expect exactly that. She is a member of this royal family, and she will follow my directives without question, just as you will. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander felt the weight of the moment, understanding that his response would determine not just Isabella's future, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. No, mother, Alexander said quietly. I will not follow directives that harm innocent people and undermine the good work that Isabella and I have accomplished together. If you proceed with this course of action, you will force me to choose between loyalty to you and loyalty to the people of Valdoria. I hope you understand which choice I will make. Queen Cordelia stared at her son in shock. In all their disagreements over the years, Alexander had never directly defied her authority so completely and publicly. You would choose a woman you've known for 5 years over the mother who raised you and the institution that will be your responsibility? Alexander took Isabella's hand, his voice firm and clear. I would choose justice over injustice, progress over stagnation, and the welfare of our people over the preservation of outdated power structures. If that means choosing Isabella's vision over yours, then yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. The sound of chanting from the courtyard grew louder, and through the window they could see that the crowd had swelled to over 1,000 people. The protesters were no longer just supporting Isabella. They were demanding answers from Queen Cordelia about why she was dismantling programs that had brought real improvements to their lives. Queen Cordelia looked from her son to Isabella to the growing crowd outside, and for the first time since the crisis began, Alexander saw something that looked like fear in his mother's eyes. She was beginning to realize that her attempt to quietly eliminate Isabella's influence had instead created the very public controversy and challenge to royal authority that she had claimed to be trying to prevent. The battle for Valdoria's future was now playing out not just within the palace walls, but in the streets and public squares where ordinary citizens were demanding a voice in their monarchy's direction. The question was no longer whether Queen Cordelia could silence Isabella, but whether the royal family could survive the crisis that her actions had created. Fourth Chronicle, the royal council meeting that afternoon, took place under unprecedented circumstances. Outside the palace, the crowd of protesters had grown to nearly 3,000 people, their chants audible even in the council chambers. Inside, the tension was equally palpable as Queen Cordelia faced a room full of advisors who were clearly uncomfortable with the situation she had created. Alexander had requested permission to address the council, a right accorded to him as heir to the throne. Queen Cordelia had been forced to agree, though she clearly hoped to present her case first and frame the narrative before he could speak. Esteemed members of the royal council, Queen Cordelia began, her voice steady despite the obvious strain she was under. We face a critical moment in our kingdom's history. The decisions we make today will determine whether Valdoria maintains its stability and traditions or whether we allow populist sentiment to undermine the carefully balanced structure of our monarchy. She paused, looking around the room at faces that showed varying degrees of support, concern, and outright skepticism. Princess Isabella's charitable work, while well-intentioned, has created an unsustainable situation where individual royal initiatives are generating more attention and loyalty than the institution of the monarchy itself. This threatens the very foundation of our constitutional system, where the crown must remain above partisan interests and popular movements. Lord Chancellor Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Your Majesty, might I ask what specific evidence supports the claim that Princess Isabella's work threatens constitutional stability? The legal framework under which she operates seems quite proper to me. Queen Cordelia's eyes narrowed slightly. The evidence is visible outside our windows, Lord Chancellor. When citizens feel more loyalty to an individual royal than to the crown itself, we approach the kind of instability that has historically led to the downfall of monarchies. But surely, interjected Lord Treasury Minister Blackwood, the fact that citizens are demonstrating in support of the monarchy, even if focused on one member, indicates strength rather than weakness in our institutions. Alexander watched this exchange with careful attention, realizing that his mother's support among the council was far from unanimous. The advisors were asking exactly the questions he would have asked, and Queen Cordelia's answers were sounding increasingly weak. "Your Majesty," said Lady Justice Minister Pemberton, "I've reviewed the legal structures governing Princess Isabella's charitable organizations. If we proceed with transferring these programs to other family members without proper legal procedures, we risk creating significant legal challenges that could be far more damaging to royal reputation than the current situation." Queen Cordelia's composure cracked slightly. "Are you suggesting that legal technicalities should override the Crown's authority to manage its own family members' activities?" "I'm suggesting that ignoring legal procedures would create exactly the kind of constitutional crisis you claim to be trying to prevent," Lady Pemberton replied diplomatically, but firmly. Alexander realized this was his moment. "Your Majesty, members of the council, may I present an alternative perspective?" Queen Cordelia gestured stiffly for him to proceed, clearly unhappy with how the discussion was developing. Alexander stood, looking around the room at advisors who had watched him grow from a young prince into the future king. 5 years ago, when Isabella and I married, we made a commitment to serve Valdoria together. That commitment led us to develop programs that have measurably improved the lives of our citizens. Literacy rates have increased, unemployment among women has decreased, and Valdoria has gained international recognition for our progressive approach to social issues. He moved to the window, gesturing toward the crowd outside. "Those people aren't protesting against the monarchy. They're protesting for it. They're demonstrating that they believe so strongly in what the royal family can accomplish that they're willing to take time from their jobs and families to defend programs that have helped them." "But that's precisely the problem," Queen Cordelia interjected. "When people demonstrate for individual royals rather than for the institution, Mother," Alexander said, turning to face her directly, "with respect, I think you're misunderstanding what's happening here. These people aren't choosing Isabella over you. They're choosing a monarchy that actively serves them over one that simply exists above them." The room fell silent as the implications of Alexander's words sank in. He was essentially arguing for a fundamental shift in how the Valdorian monarchy operated. "The question before us isn't whether Isabella's work threatens royal authority," Alexander continued. "The question is whether we want to lead a kingdom that expects its monarchy to remain distant and traditional, or whether we want to lead a kingdom that expects its monarchy to be engaged and effective." Lord Chancellor Morrison leaned forward. "Your Highness, are you suggesting a formal change in royal policy regarding public engagement?" "I'm suggesting that we acknowledge reality. The world has changed, and our people's expectations have changed with it. Isabella's success proves that active royal engagement strengthens rather than weakens public support for the monarchy. Dismantling her work would send the message that we're more interested in preserving power than in serving our people." Queen Cordelia stood abruptly. "Alexander, you're speaking about fundamental changes to centuries of royal tradition based on 5 years of what amounts to public relations work. I'm speaking about fundamental changes based on measurable improvements to our citizens' lives and demonstrable increases in public support for the royal family," Alexander replied calmly. "Mother, the monarchy's survival depends on our ability to remain relevant to the people we serve. Isabella has shown us how to do that while maintaining dignity and tradition." Lord Treasury Minister Blackwood cleared his throat. "If I may, Your Majesty, the economic impact of Princess Isabella's programs has been quite significant. The education initiatives alone have projected long-term benefits that far exceed their costs. From a purely financial perspective, these programs are assets to the kingdom." Alexander saw his opening, which raises another important point. If we transfer these programs to other family members, we lose Isabella's personal relationships with international funding sources, her detailed knowledge of program operations, and her established credibility with the communities being served. The practical result would likely be the collapse of many of these initiatives, regardless of our intentions. Queen Cordelia looked around the room, clearly realizing that her support was eroding rapidly. Are you all suggesting that I should reverse my decision and allow Isabella to continue undermining royal hierarchy? Your Majesty, Lord Chancellor Morrison said carefully, I think we're suggesting that perhaps the situation requires a different approach than the one initially considered. The sound of the crowd outside grew louder, and through the windows they could see that media trucks had arrived, bringing national and international attention to the crisis. Queen Cordelia walked to the window and stared down at the protesters for a long moment. When she turned back to the room, her expression had changed. The imperious authority was still there, but it was tempered by something that looked like resignation. What do you propose, Alexander? I propose that we acknowledge publicly that there was a misunderstanding about the future of Isabella's programs. We announce that after careful consideration, the royal family has decided to expand rather than restrict her charitable work in recognition of its success and importance to the kingdom. That would make it appear that I was wrong, Queen Cordelia said quietly. Alexander approached his mother, speaking gently but firmly. It would make it appear that you listened to counsel, considered the evidence, and made the decision that best serves Valdoria. That's what good monarchs do, Mother. They adapt when circumstances require it. Queen Cordelia looked at her son for a long moment, seeing not the young prince she had raised, but the future king he had become. She realized that this crisis had forced her to confront a truth she had been avoiding. Alexander was ready to rule, and his vision for the monarchy was different from hers. And if I agree to this approach, what assurances do I have that Isabella will respect proper royal protocols going forward? Isabella spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Your Majesty, I propose that we establish a formal structure for royal charitable work with clear guidelines and regular consultation between family members. I welcome oversight that ensures our work serves the kingdom's best interests. Queen Cordelia studied her daughter-in-law, recognizing both an olive branch and a demonstration of political sophistication that she had previously underestimated. Very well, Queen Cordelia said finally. We will announce that the royal family has decided to formalize and expand Princess Isabella's charitable work within a new framework that ensures proper coordination and oversight. The relief in the room was palpable, but Alexander knew this was only the beginning of a larger transformation in how the Valdorian monarchy would operate. Later that evening, as the crowd outside celebrated the announcement of Isabella's expanded role, Alexander and his wife sat in their private quarters, reflecting on the dramatic events of the past week. Do you think your mother will truly accept this new arrangement? Isabella asked. Alexander considered the question carefully. I think she's beginning to understand that fighting against change is more dangerous than adapting to it. This crisis taught all of us something important about the relationship between the monarchy and the people. Isabella smiled, but her expression remained thoughtful. I never wanted to create a rift between you and your mother. You didn't create anything, Isabella. You revealed something that was already there, a fundamental disagreement about what the monarchy should be in the modern world. The rift would have appeared eventually. At least this way, we had some control over how it was resolved. Outside their window, they could see the last of the protesters dispersing, many carrying signs that now read, "Thank you, Princess Isabella," and "Long live the royal family." The crisis had ended, but it had also marked the beginning of a new era for Valdoria's monarchy. Queen Cordelia, in her own chambers, looked out at the same scene and reflected on the lessons of the past week. She had learned that attempting to suppress change often creates more disruption than embracing it, and that her son had developed into a leader worthy of the crown he would one day wear. Most importantly, she had learned that the monarchy's survival depended not on maintaining absolute control, but on maintaining the trust and support of the people they served. Isabella's popularity hadn't threatened the crown. It had strengthened it by demonstrating the monarchy's capacity to evolve and remain relevant. As the palace settled into an unusual peace that night, all three members of the royal family understood that they had weathered more than just a family crisis. They had navigated the kind of fundamental transition that would define the monarchy for generations to come, emerging stronger and more unified in their commitment to serving Valdoria and its people. The bold move that had started as Queen Cordelia's attempt to preserve tradition had ultimately become the catalyst for the monarchy's transformation into an institution better equipped to face the challenges of the modern world.